My name is Brahima Kulubali. I'm the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. It gives me really great pleasure to welcome back our World Bank colleagues to discuss the 2021 edition of the Changing Wealth of Nations report, which builds on the ones we discussed back in 2018 at Brookings. The report was just released this morning, and it is the fourth edition of this groundbreaking work that assesses a country's wealth over time, and it introduces the concept of wealth as a complementary indicator to GDP in measuring socioeconomic progress. So the main premise then of today's discussion is that as useful as GDP is as a metric, it has limitations when it comes to the assessment of socioeconomic progress. And Simon Kuznets, who first developed the modern day measures of GDP in the early 1930s, was among the first to recognize its limitations. And in a famous quote, Robert Kennedy referred to GDP as a measure of everything except that which makes life worthwhile. So among those limitations, it doesn't capture human and natural capital, unpaid work at home. GDP also fails to account for environmental externalities and non-material aspects of welfare, such as happiness and well-being. And that topic is actually an important area of research for us at Brookings, being led by my colleague, Carol Grenham. And we look back to the pandemic and the disruptive effect it has had on lives, as well as the looming climate crisis, have all brought into focus the importance of many of these considerations. And as the world leaders soon gather at the UN Climate Change Conference, we policymakers, development practitioners, educators, and researchers must rethink and reimagine how we approach and understand economic development, including evaluating environmental, social, and governance measures beyond the traditional monetary metrics. The report and today's conversation could not have been more timely. The report tracks the wealth of 246 countries between 1995 and 2018. It measures the economic value of renewable capital, such as forests, ocean resources, non-renewable natural capital, such as mineral and fossil fuels, human capital, as well as produced capital, including infrastructure, and then also net foreign assets. With each edition of the report, it gets more and more comprehensive, thanks to the hard work of our colleagues at the World Bank. Compare, for example, with the 2018 edition, this report has expanded its approach to measuring national wealth, and by increasing the number of countries covered, it also added measures for the blue natural capital, like marine fishery and mangrove. And for the first time, the report examines the projected impact of future risks, such as climate change and the low carbon transition, which is quite critical. If you do not have a copy, I would encourage you to download one from the World Bank's website. In the next portion of this event, Jim Cast, a senior economist in the Office of the Chief Economist of the Africa region, and Shrikov Peshko, who is lead economist in the environment, natural resources, and blue economy practice at the World Bank, will share some key findings. The presentation will then be followed by a great panel discussion moderated by David Pilling, who is Africa editor of the Financial Times. And David has been actually a great partner of his Brookings discussions. He moderated the 2018 event on this subject. For those who attended, you'll remember. And he's also author of a book entitled The Growth Delusion, Wealth, Poverty, and the Well-Being of Nations, which I would also encourage you to read if you haven't already. So he comes equipped with deep knowledge and background on this topic. We are also pleased and grateful to have a panel of experts who will enrich the conversation from various perspectives. It features Karen Kemper, who is Global Director for Environment, Natural Resources, and the Blue Economy at the World Bank. And Rodolfo Lassi, who is Environment Director at the OECD, and my colleague then and lead expert on sustainability, Senior Fellow Amar Bhattacharya. You can join or follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag CWON 2021. Again, that is CWON 2021. You can also submit your questions using the same hashtag. With that, it's my pleasure then to turn over the mic to Jim and Shrikar for the presentation. Over to you.
Great. Hopefully you can see my screen. Okay. Thank you very much, Cool, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and great to be back at Brookings to launch the next edition of the Changing Wealth of Nations. So my name is Jim Cust, and myself and Gregor, as you heard, are going to take you through some of the highlights from the new report before we hand over to the panel discussion. So the first thing to say is the Changing Wealth of Nations 2021 is a large team effort. So you'll see the editors of the report listed here, but it also draws in academics and authors and collaborators from all over the world who have contributed to this significant report. And you can download it at the website listed below, worldbank.org/CWON. So first, I want to say a little bit about what the Changing Wealth of Nations 2021 is. So as you heard from Cool, it's both a report, but also a database of wealth accounts for 146 countries, tracing the evolution of their wealth in these different assets that we measure all the way back since 1995. It's the fourth report in the series. So the first one in 2005, Where is the Wealth of Nations, really established this concept, but it's been developed and expanded ever since then. And the theme for this year's report is managing assets for the future. So that means for the first time, we're considering the future wealth of nations and not just analyzing the historic trends in wealth in the past. So what does the future wealth of nations look like? Well, we're considering questions such as what impact COVID-19 could have on human capital wealth across countries. We also look at climate risks and the implications of global decarbonization. So one of the questions we're really interested in this time around is how policy choices shape wealth. So one example of this is thinking about how climate policies might impact the value of fossil fuel wealth held under the ground in many countries, and what policymakers today should do about that how they might manage that risk that comes from global climate policy and decarbonization. So the purpose of the Changing Wealth of Nations is really to be a tool to help governments and countries to look beyond GDP. GDP is great for measuring growth and for comparing between countries, but as we already heard from Cool, it has serious limitations. So what wealth accounting does, it allows you to measure the underlying assets that generate income that contribute to GDP. Ultimately, GDP growth is sustainable only if the asset base of a country isn't shrinking. And so we can look at measures like the change in wealth per capita to measure how the asset base is changing and to see how sustainable prosperity is likely to be into the future. So comprehensive wealth covers a wide range of asset types. In the wealth accounts, we measure everything from produced capital, which is the machines and structures and cities, to natural capital, where we distinguish between non-renewable natural capital and renewable natural capital, measuring things like fossil fuels, minerals, but also cropland and forests. And for the first time this year, we also add in blue natural capital, which covers marine fisheries and the value in mangroves, for example. We also measure human capital and the position of countries in terms of their net foreign assets. So this together forms the wealth of a country, and wealth is used to generate income, which contributes to our measure of GDP. But as I said before, the asset base is crucial to determining how sustainable that GDP and ultimately how sustainable the prosperity of a country is likely to be. So what do we find? Well, this map shows you the changes in wealth per capita since 1995. And as you can see from the colors of the map, the picture is quite varied. So as you'll see, some countries have increased and expanded their wealth per capita significantly. So many countries in Asia, you'll see some in Latin America and Eastern Europe, countries in Africa like Ethiopia and Mozambique. While we also find there are 26 countries that have had declining or stagnant wealth per capita since 1995. So what does that mean? Well, it tells us that the investment rate in produced capital may have been insufficient, or that the use of non-renewable resources like mineral extraction or oil extraction hasn't been sufficiently reinvested into other forms of capital, whether it's the investments into education and human capital, or whether it's education into the produced capital, hasn't been sufficient to lead to a net increase in per capita wealth over this period. And so why might we worry about that? Well, this is the declining asset base that we worry about in terms of economic sustainability. So if you're depleting and degrading your assets in order to achieve GDP growth, then this puts at risk the sustainability of that prosperity into the future. So so we can go into each of the assets that we measure as part of the changing wealth of nations and analyze key trends in each of those asset categories to try and determine what might be causing this, what might be leading to this relationship where we see declining or stagnant changes in wealth per capita in some countries and large increases in wealth per capita in other countries. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Grzegorz, who's going to take you through some of the key findings. Just a snapshot. There's a long report that you can download as well, just to give you an idea of how we can dig into some of these assets and analyze what might be going on.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here. So Jim has taken you through the broad landscape of wealth and navigated you through this trends of the broad portfolio of national assets. Let me give you a sneak peek of some of the key findings related to individual assets and some of the policy implications that we found very intriguing. So as human, let me start from the obvious, which is us, which is the humans as the human capital. So we represent as humans the largest share of our total wealth. Our numbers, our skills, our health, they represent over 64% of the total wealth globally in 2018. There are some disturbing disparities between the wealth, human capital per capita between OECD, high-income countries and the low-income countries. But we also found that, interestingly, the high-income non-OECD countries have had a very low growth of human capital over the last 20 years. And there is a chapter 12 that analyzes why the allocation and abundance of and reliance on non-renewable natural capital, mainly fossil fuels, can be associated with the reduction of the rate of accumulation of human capital. This may be another symptom of the resource curse. What was also disturbing was to find the striking disparities between the male and female human capital. Since 1995 to 2018, the share of female wealth in total human capital increased, but very little, only from 35% in 20 plus years from now to 37% now. So women hold the highest share of human capital in Latin America, in Caribbeans, but staggering, only 30% of the human capital in South Asia is held by women. It just suggests that women still have very limited access to paid employment, and those women who work, they earn very low wages compared to men. So next, let's look at the at the capital that was offered to us free of charge by nature, which is natural capital, the renewable part of it. This changing wealth of nations for the first time includes the value of the blue natural capital, fisheries and mangroves. And we've seen some, again, very interesting trends as over the last 20 years, the value of blue natural capital fell by more than a half. And it was mainly due to the very significant collapse of the value of fisheries by 83% over this period. And it was mainly driven by overfishing, by the physical depletion of the fish stocks, driven by policies, by perverse subsidies, and as well as the rising costs. And that had undermined the wealth of the marine fisheries. However, this dramatic loss of the value of fisheries was partly compensated by the increase in the value of mangroves. Mangroves, however, when we looked at the physical area of mangroves, mangroves shrunk in physical terms. However, their monetary value of the remaining mangroves increased by more than 2.5 times because of the increase of the value of the coastal capital, the fancy hotels, the infrastructure, the ports that the mangroves protect. And going forward, investment in mangrove restoration will yield even higher rates of return as the sea level rises and as climate change will increase the frequency and intensity of storm surges, but also because the coastal capital will continue to be even more expensive, the build infrastructure on the coast that the mangroves protect. So it shows you how important natural capital can be in the adaptation to the climate change. Then look at the flip side of the natural capital, which is the wealth that is underground, the fossil fuels in particular. So we are all kind of aware that if the goals of the Paris Agreement were to be achieved, the consumption of the fossil fuels will go down over time. But the wealth perspective at this discussion on the future value of fossil fuels brings some rigor, realism, and a bigger picture to this discussion, to this debate on stranded fossil fuel assets. So we have calculated the stranded assets, and we have the high number in the most ambitious climate policy scenario of $6.2 trillion over the period of lost resource rents. But what is really important is the differences in the distribution of stranded assets between scenarios, between fuel types and the countries, because this tells us a lot about the effective strategies to engage those often more reluctant countries that depend on fossil fuels into the cooperative climate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we run several what-if scenarios to represent the uncertainty about the possible future climate and trade policies that different groups of countries, especially those who import fossil fuels and those who export fossil fuels, can make the choices that they can make in future under the Paris Agreement. So overall, clearly the fossil fuel asset value decreases significantly in all scenarios consistent with 2 degrees and even further in scenarios consistent with 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. It's both in absolute terms against the base year as well, and especially against the expected reference scenario. But fossil fuel wealth declines less than the physical output, which is a good news for climate because climate impact is driven by the emissions, hence consumption and burning of the volume of fossil fuels that is being burned. But it's also a good news for the owners of fossil fuel reserves that remain in production because their revenues and rents per unit of energy can go up. So the worst news is that even in our general equilibrium model, we see some quite significant volatility of the because the low carbon transition will be associated with a lot of discrete events where some of the major suppliers exit the market, then the prices free fall, and then when there is some major supply demand shock, the prices may also react quite volatile. Now, some intriguing results also inform political economy of the cooperative climate action. So we looked at the distribution of these losses between oil exporters and coal and gas exporters, and we found that oil wealth really benefits from cooperative climate action, and it does not always apply for the gas and coal exporters. So there may be misaligned long-term incentives between the fossil fuel owners, but also there will be there is a global conclusion that often the policies that protects the wealth of fossil fuel owners are not good for the long-term growth and welfare of the citizens of these countries. So there are these policy relevant insights from the analysis of how the fossil fuel wealth may be impacted by low carbon transition. And last piece of asset that I'd like to draw your attention to in this presentation are the renewable energy. We found that it is still unaccounted wealth of nations. So while fossil fuel assets are right and center in the balance sheet of the countries, the renewable energy is not. The national balance sheets account for the book value of the wind farms and turbines, but not the underlying energy asset. It's like, the balance sheet would account for the value of the oil rig, but not the oil that this rig is pumping. So we have proposed a balance sheet ready methodology to calculate the renewable energy wealth as assets. And we proved this concept by developing pilot renewable energy accounts for 15 countries. We found that in some of the fossil fuel rich countries like Canada, for instance, the value of renewable energy assets has already exceeded the abundant value of the total fossil fuel wealth of this country. And as you see from this slide, the hydropower so far has dominated the total renewable energy wealth in all these 15 countries. Solar and wind, at least by 2017, where we had calculated the data, still rarely created economic rents, which is typical for the nascent industries with maturing technologies. The volume of electricity generation has increased in the recent years, however, because of the falling costs. And by now, perhaps a lot of solar and wind energy generation already creates significant wealth in several countries. We also run the simulations for South African power pool to see how the policies can evoke the value of renewable energy. And we found that for South Africa, for instance, the value of solar and wind energy could exceed the value of coal reserves by 2020, so by now already. And in Angola, the combined value of hydro and solar energy could match the value of natural gas by 2020 as well. So last is some general policy recommendations that come across from several different analytical pieces that you can find in the report. First of all, we recommend the countries to measure and monitor wealth in addition to the annual flow measures such as GDP, using the established standards of systems of national accounts and systems of environmental economic accounting. Next is the investment in wealth. And first of all, especially in the wealth components that have a public good character, that are underpriced and undervalued by the markets, such as certain elements of the human capital and renewable natural capital. It's not only about public investments, it's about also governments to allocate property or user rights to the common assets and correct market failures that prevent the allocation of capital of this natural and human capital by private investors. Third is to create strong policy incentives to protect and increase the value of this most vulnerable and least visible wealth. This is about setting the pricing incentives right and correcting failures of the market to recognize the value of assets that we as market participants normally don't see. And this would lead to the much more diversified and rebalanced overall portfolio of wealth, making the growth more sustainable and more resilient, and transcending this concept of the traditional diversification of products and exports into the broader view of the diversification of the portfolio of assets that we as nations have at our disposal, because it overcomes that short-sightedness and illuminate the blind spots that we have making our everyday decisions. So this is all from us as a team. Thank you very much. And now I hand over to David Peeling, who is our fantastic moderator, to lead the distinguished panel that will follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Grzegorz. I hope you can all hear me. It's a great privilege to be here today. I think this report is extremely important. As Kuhl said in his introduction, I wrote a book while working at the FT called The Growth Delusion. And there were many aspects to what in a sense was a critique of GDP. But one of them was that wealth is simply not considered, GDP really being a measure of flow, or what one might call income. If you think of a company, we can think of a company's profits, and the company's profits might be fantastic, but the underlying reason for that may be that it sold all its machinery, fired all its workers, and sold its land. So next year's profits are not going to be very good. And yet GDP profits tell you really nothing about that. So examining the wealth of a nation gives you a whole other dimension. As we'll see, that throws up many theoretical and practical questions, and there are limitations even to the fantastic work that this report has done. And I hope that we can discuss some of that. Unfortunately, we have an amazing panel. Before I get to introducing the panelists, thank you all for joining us. If any of you would like to ask questions, I will try to feed in some of those questions as we go along. The best way is to tweet those questions using the hashtag Kwon, that's CWON for Changing Wealth of Nations, Kwon 2021. So that's hashtag CWON 2021. The three panelists that we are fortunate enough to have today, first of all, we have Karen Kemper, who's the Global Director for Environment and Blue Economy at the World Bank. Amar Bhattacharya, Senior Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings, and Rodolfo Lassi, Director for the Environment Directorate of the OECD. Thank you all very much for joining us. I would like to start with Karen, if I may, and I'd like to go to basics. There you are, Karen. I'd like to go back to basics first of all, before we kind of, interrogate this report further. The first question is just why? Why is the World Bank putting so much weight and intellectual heft and resource behind developing what is an entirely really new set of accounts beyond GDP?
Thank you, David. And first of all, let me say that I'm really, really delighted to be here. And I would like to thank our colleagues at Brookings for hosting this event in the context of the launching of the Changing Wealth of Nations. It is really great that you are doing this. And that really relates to your question, David, of why is this so important to us? Why do we think this is a big deal to go beyond GDP and to develop this form of wealth accounting? And the reason we do that is that it helps countries see their asset base, including the natural capital, which can be overlooked and often is overlooked in standard macroeconomic indicators like GDP. GDP growth, as we just heard also from Grzegorz and Jim, if you have GDP growth that's at the expense of your assets that you have, it's unsustainable. So using wealth alongside GDP can help countries monitor sustainability. And nature especially has too often been invisible in national finances. So putting natural capital on balance sheets can help address this. Now, from the World Bank perspective and from a developing country development perspective, that's especially important because many developing countries are very rich in natural assets. So a key part of the development process will be about how one can manage them and how countries build prosperity without compromising their long-term sustainability. So that's why we are into this very much.
Okay, I'm going to probe you later on some of the limitations as well as some of the revelations, in a sense, of the wealth accounting methodology. But first of all, how receptive have governments, politicians, finance ministries, NGOs, all the various stakeholders, how receptive have they been to this new way? And it is a new way, in a sense, of looking at wealth. Because so much of our, just as companies like to report quarterly profits, so you know, we are kind of trapped in this GDP world. Have you found that there is a good reception for this new methodology?
That's actually a very good question. You know, the first Changing Wealth of Nations was issued in 2005. And then we had various others that have gone with 5-6 years difference in time, including because at the time it took longer to get the data. But the last one that we launched was in 2018, and now we are in 2021. And we feel that there has been a great uptake of this type of wealth accounting and that the demand for this kind of approaches really has grown. So when we started at the time, it was a fairly new concept. Now it is much more mainstream. There are dozens of countries that are in one way or another calculating their natural capital. And for instance, the recent UK government Das Gupta report that was about the economics of biodiversity, it actually explicitly called for injecting natural capital into national accounting. So it's really becoming much more mainstream. There are countries like New Zealand that have adopted a very comprehensive wealth accounting approach across all the different assets that they call the Living Standards Framework. And not unlike what we are doing in the report, they measure natural capital, human capital, financial and produced capital, plus social capital. And then there are other countries such as Zambia and Colombia, for example, that have adopted natural capital accounting approaches to better understand how they can harness their natural wealth. Let me just give you one example. For instance, Zambia is doing accounts for forests and water, which then help the government as it makes policy decisions on how best to use natural resources for now and for generations to come.
Thank you very much. Many follow-ups there, but let me turn first of all to Amar. What do you think the concrete implications are for development? And, you know, as we, in the run up to COP26, and a lot of this discussion is bound to be about the environment, for the energy transition. What are the implications of this report?
So maybe just to set it in context, first just to congratulate the team and the World Bank. This really is a milestone report building on now a great tradition of counting for wealth in its all its dimensions. And this report pushes in particular, I think, the policy implications at a time which is, really quite pivotal for the world. If you look at the next 3 decades, we will determine the future of development and we will determine the future of climate. Why? Because in the next 3 decades, we will be at a point where, we can close the development gap. As was pointed out by Jim, there's a big gap in wealth between not just low-income countries, but low and many middle-income countries with high-income countries. So this is a period going to be of convergence, and that is a great opportunity. And we have to do that at a time where the world will add 2 billion people to the planet, all of them in the developing world other than China. So this is a great opportunity for development, but it will mean a massive buildup of assets of all kinds. And if we repeat what we did in the past growth model, we will not be able to have a sustainable development or growth path, and we will certainly destroy the planet. And that takes you to the second part, which is we are running out of time on the climate agenda. As the latest IPCC report highlights, we are seeing accelerating climate change, accelerating risks, and a shrinking window to act on climate change. So the policy implications of this report are really of paramount importance. And they have to be applied both at the country level, but also at the global level. So what's the path to capital? It's investment. How do we build capital? We invest. And the major thesis I would put to you is that the world requires a very major push on investment in this coming years. It's not just the SDGs, it's beyond the SDGs. So we have to anticipate that, and we have to ask the question, where is that investment needed? What are the impediments behind that investment? How do we make that investment sustainable? And I think the report is absolutely right. The first area of focus has to be on human capital development and asking the question, why is it that we are not performing as well on human capital development as we should? And you have to particularly keep in mind that demographic transition that I was talking about. Second, we need produced capital, but it has to be a very different kind of produced capital. What are the policies that are going to be required? And the most important policy is a massive acceleration of energy transition. Energy is crucial for development, it's crucial for climate. How we get that right in countries that are low income, in countries like South Africa, India, Indonesia, will be crucial. The third aspect of investment that will be extremely important is resilience. We have to invest in resilience because we are facing a world of increased shocks. How do we do that? How do we make capital more resilient in the face of shocks? And finally, we have to think about nature, the value that ecosystems and natural capitals brings to the equation. How do we restore rather than destroy nature? And as Karen had mentioned, the natural assets are determined by geography, not by income. So we have to focus on natural capital, where they are. And of course, there are some natural capital like, agricultural land that's distributed very evenly. Other kinds of natural capital, less so. Certainly, with forests, we have to think about the big forest areas of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and the Indonesia, Papua region. How do we ensure that those investments are made? So I think this report gives us a real rich agenda, which we can apply at the individual country level, but that must also guide our global vision, thinking, and action.
Okay, that's a fantastic overview. I want to move to Rodolfo in a second, but just a quick follow-up, because I like sort of concrete examples so we can think about this in the specific. I know you've done some work on South Africa, and now South Africa wants to move to become a skilled workforce economy, i.e. with more human capital. And we know that it has natural capital, but some of the natural capital that will appear on its balance sheet as measured by this report is coal. And now we know that coal is probably overvalued in those accounts because the world is moving away from fossil fuels, and the regulatory environment may begin to penalize South Africa, perhaps in South Africa itself, certainly when South Africa begins to export to Europe with things like carbon border adjustment. So my question is, if you are the South African government and you're looking at this balance sheet as now revealed in this report, what do you do with that? What do you do with that in mapping out your transition to, a sustainable growth, high tech, highly skilled? How do you turn coal, or maybe not coal, into those things that you want?
So that's an excellent framing, David. So let's take the situation today. South Africa is massively underinvesting in its human capital. Mm-hmm. And we know, as from the analysis in the report points out, that actually it has a much greater stock of renewable capital that is not recognized. Okay. So what's the answer? The solution is to accelerate the phase out of coal. It is to deal with the just transition issues that will arise in terms of people and places associated with the coal economy. And it is to invest in a low carbon future and opportunities that come in a low carbon future much broader and beyond coal. That is precisely what South Africa is doing right now. They have established a presidential commission to come out with a long-term vision. They have committed to net zero by 2050, which is extraordinary for a coal-based economy, provided the international community steps up and does its side of the bargain. And again, the answer to this is better, smarter investment in that human capital, in a different kind of produced capital, but recognizing that there will be adjustment costs of two kinds. Adjustment costs that are, of the people and places, but also adjustment costs in the phasing out of capital that's already there. And that's, very much centered around the utility, Eskom in South Africa. But there is a clear program that has been laid out, and South Africa intends to come to COP26 precisely with such a program.
Thank you. Rodolfo, if I may turn to you. First of all, a general question. What were your main takeaways from this report? I think you're on mute. Rodolfo, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you. I'll go to Karen. Can I go to Karen, and then I will come back to you, Rodolfo. What, Karen, do you think are the policy recommendations that immediately come out of this report?
Well, there's 4 key recommendations. Of course, as we've heard, from different angles, you could make many more out of it. But one is that countries should measure and monitor comprehensive wealth. So, as we were saying before, not just what is produced capital or financial wealth, but really all wealth, and that includes natural capital, but also includes actually the human capital, where we have a big emphasis also in the report. And the report provides the methods and examples for countries what to do and how to do their own wealth accounting. And the second one is countries should invest in their assets. And we heard a little bit about that from Amar right now. So building up the human capital and natural capital to sustain future prosperity. And there, I think the report provides examples of how richer countries have invested in key assets, a path that other countries can emulate. And it also identifies areas where investment might be distorted by undervaluing such investments. The third policy recommendations is that governments can act to address market failures and mispricing of assets. So, for example, to reduce pressures of overfishing, which comes from subsidies and the management of fish stocks and catch quotas, or pressures of deforestation from the undervaluation of forest ecosystem services and carbon retention relative to agricultural land. So the policy point is this can be addressed. It doesn't need to be like that. And that comes to the fore through the report. And then the fourth key recommendation is to diversify the asset portfolio, and that diversification can manage risks and can improve resilience. And there, for instance, the report examines how fossil fuel-rich countries can pursue diversification of assets rather than just thinking of exporting these assets, but really to diversify and reduce the risk that they face from the global decarbonization in the future and from an over-reliance on volatile sources of wealth, such as oil and gas. And that speaks a little bit to what Amar was mentioning also in response to your question right now. So these are the four key recommendations.
Okay, fine. I just had a little difficulty hearing just the very last sentence, but that's fine. Rodolfo, are you now live?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly. That's great. We're very happy to have you. Could I ask you what you think the key takeaways were? And then I want to go on to carbon price.
First of all, I would like to really congratulate the World Bank Group for putting the well-being issue on the scene today, 3 days before the COP26, just as environment, climate discussions, negotiations focus on reducing greenhouse gases or just CO2. So this well-being lens is quite important. The contribution of this report is to provide a comprehensive approach with the new metrics that are including different indicators, not only CO2 emissions. For the environment domain, this is quite relevant now that we are looking that our societies are expecting a new normal that can be based in this idea of building back better. But how to do it if we do not measure well the things that are relevant for the people, the things that are relevant for the population. Let me give you just one example of this new well-being lens that we are applying at the OECD. Instead of talking about how many electric buses or electric cars we need in one city or in one region, we have to look at the accessibility of the people to goods and services, and do we really need those gadgets or those physical infrastructures that are, of course, adding more greenhouse gases or are fragmenting the ecosystems? Or we can solve the needs of the populations with a more sustainable, of course, organization, not only things that we are adding to our assets. So we have to keep our natural assets. We have to value the natural assets that surround us, but also we have to incorporate that in the economy. So the measurements, how we can monitor the policy recommendations that are included in the report are quite relevant in this discussion.
Right. Can I ask you how we would, and I know there's a lot of interest in this question, how we would inject a carbon price into this kind of accounting, because the methodology as it works at the moment, and some of the lead authors have spoken about this explicitly. For example, overvalues oil. It overvalues oil because it doesn't measure the externalities. Plus, we know that the regulatory and political environment is turning against fossil fuels. So fossil fuels on your balance sheet may not be worth as much as you think they're worth. On the other hand, it undervalues trees, and those trees may only be valued, it may only reflect the value for if you chop down those trees and sell them, but not the what economists call the ecosystem services, for example, the carbon capture. And now we begin to address that balance, presumably, if there were a $50 or $100 price for a ton of carbon that was universal. And clearly there isn't that at the moment. We're seeing these different markets kind of pop up. How would a carbon price change the game and change how we use these sort of wealth accounts?
Well, first, we need to look at both sides of the coin when we talk about carbon taxes, for example, or carbon pricing. Because in the other side of the economy, we have a lot of subsidies for fossil fuel assets. If we eliminate those subsidies, we will be, of course, comparing things with a different metric. So the first policy that we are promoting in the G20 forum, but also in the G20 and B7 forum, is to reduce or eliminate completely the fossil fuel subsidies. Doing that, we have to create direct and indirect carbon prices. We are measuring effective carbon rates in order to really see if the carbon pricing system of arrangements in our countries are effective to reduce emissions and just to incorporate a real value of our natural assets and the externalities that are now mainly reflecting health problems in the society. We are, for example, arguing in favor of many mitigation efforts because they have co-benefits for the population, reducing air pollution or pollutants that are released when we burn fossil fuels. So if we take into account those externalities in the real price of the fuels that we are using right now, 80% of the energy coming from fossil fuels today, well, we will be able to see what is the real cost of using those very dirty assets.
Amar, I'd like to ask you the same question, and because it strikes me as it's not a flaw, but it's because it's very well acknowledged, but it is a curiosity, let's say, of these accounts. So, for example, if you are Gabon, a country I visited recently, you've relied on oil for income, but that oil is now running down, and what you're left with is huge swathes of forest, which cover, I think, roughly 90% of the country, a country about the size of the UK. And now, it's all very well in the abstract to say one should invest in one's natural capital, the forest, but if you no longer have an income from oil, the temptation will clearly be to chop down those trees and to diminish your natural capital, not to add to it, unless in concrete terms you can actually make money from that natural capital. And carbon seems to be, a carbon price seems to be one, not the only, but one of the missing elements. How do you think about a carbon price? You're on mute as well, Amar.
So sorry. As an economist, of course, I think carbon price is the most efficient way to send signals. Yes. But I equally, as a pragmatic economist, I know that you have to use all tools at your disposal. So, we must think about, regulations. Just think about the power, for example, if the G7 and the whole world said we are going to phase out, internal combustion engines by 2035. It's a very powerful incentive for the private sector to act. We must also think about public investment, public procurement, as the OECD has argued, can play a very important role in shifting, incentives. So carbon pricing is very important, but we must look at the panoply of policies given the, tremendous urgency now to shift from a fossil fuel-based economy to a low carbon path. The challenge for a case like Gabon or a Côte d'Ivoire that finds new oil or new gas is complicated. Obviously for a country which is low income, you come across a pot of gold and somebody is saying, don't sell that gold, doesn't quite make sense from looking at it from the country's point of view. And the way to persuade countries is in two ways, in my view. First, the risk of stranded assets. So investments that have not been made, you should be able to persuade countries to make those investments, you may never recoup it. Investing in a coal-fired power plant right now is a sunk and a stranded asset. It's also stranded jobs. So, we should persuade countries it's not a worthwhile course of action. The second, which and more difficult, is what if I have, a lot of oil, what am I going to do with it? Well, the market will determine that, and carbon pricing is one way to do it. In a similar way, putting a price on carbon will greatly incentivize countries to, of course, preserve their natural assets. Because, you will get credit in some sense for doing it. And we need international mechanisms for it. We do not yet have a robust enough international mechanism to compensate countries for doing that. So we have to kind of, create the incentives for that long term. And the third, which you didn't mention, of course, the future lies primarily in investing in the human capital. That's what will ultimately determine the future, because in investing in human capital, we will also get better produced capital. So it is that balance of capital that is underpinning the thesis of this report that I think we have to come back, but in a very practical way, country after country.
Okay, Karen, if I could come to you and change the subject again. In a minute, I'm going to bring in some of the questions from the audience. You're an expert on blue natural capital. The report makes for quite grim reading, does it not? Fisheries have gone down spectacularly, and there we have, what might be called the tragedy of the commons. A lot of the fish, swim between nations, and the incentive is to fish them out as quickly as you can while you can. The second, this rather sort of curious finding about mangroves, which is that the value of them has gone up, but the actual amount of them has gone down. So in a sense, what that is, I suppose, saying is that the value of the produced capital, the buildings and motorways and hotels, as was mentioned, that's gone up, and therefore the mangroves are protecting a higher value of produced capital. But I guess my question, just to come back a bit, is, does this make grim reading for our oceans? And is this irreversible, or is there anything that can be done to reverse this?
Thanks for the question, David. One of the areas that we are very interested in, and I'm actually personally very interested in, is the oceans and the blue economy. And indeed, you are right that the findings are kind of striking because in a way, the importance of mangroves and fisheries in blue natural capital has kind of reversed. The fisheries have declined, while one would think, well, there's so much fish in the ocean, so it should go up. And the mangroves have gone up when we hear that everywhere the mangroves are getting cut down. And so in a way, I think that it's a mix of grim reading that tells us we do need to act now around the oceans, because it shows us that overfishing is really taking us in a direction where we do not want to go. We now know that overfishing is not just overfishing, and it has economic consequences in those areas where there's overfishing, and then income goes down for those countries. But we know that it affects the entire ecosystem. And so very, very heavy overfishing makes it more difficult to rebound. Yet we have seen that actually rebound is possible. So we are not at the point yet that if we get a handle on fisheries, and including on the subsidies that lead to overfishing, that we could not have the rebound. And I think some of that was seen during the COVID pandemic, when some fishing went down, and then you already had some recovery in certain types of stocks. Now, on the mangroves, it's an interesting thing, because in many countries, mangroves are just seen as something that is there and where you could actually build infrastructure on the coast, and for that you need to clear out the mangroves. And to show that mangroves really have a value, and that the more productive production you have on other investments and that go up in value, the more valuable your mangroves become. We really hope that by including that mangrove analysis into the report in this way, that we can influence that debate a bit and show that number one, there's mangrove areas today that you want to maintain because of your investments today, but you also may want to think about the future. And again, the idea with a lot of this is to give a bit of an idea to decision makers of where the trade-offs are and how they can proactively manage their natural assets and why it makes sense. So it's a picture which shows us we can do things. It could get grim, but we are certainly on time to really steer in the right direction.
Okay, now a related topic. Amar mentioned giving credit for natural capital. The Seychelles issued a blue bond, an experimental blue bond for which it got paid, I think, a relatively small amount of money. Is this the way of the future? And I want to bring in Rodolfo afterwards on a similar question. But first of all,
It certainly is one part. The World Bank was very heavily engaged in the blue bond. We supported the Seychelles to issue it. There were also a number of other actors. It was a very interesting package. And in the end, 3 impact investors invested in the blue bond. As you say, it was quite small. It was $15 million. And you could argue, well, maybe the Seychelles could have found that money in some other way. But they really wanted to make the point that if you put in place the right governance, if you can show that you can positively well manage your blue economy, then you can attract investors into this space. And they managed to make the point. They were the first country that issued such a blue bond. And certainly we do hope that there will be others that follow. But of course, it has underlying policy shifts that the Seychelles made. And that is a little bit the crux.
Was the money...
Say that again,
was the money for repairing coral?
It was a blend. It was both to support the governance around fisheries, but also part of the money was for communities. So okay. There's also the social angle that is in there, but it's a blend of what they have done with the money.
Rodolfo, I wondered if you would like to talk about some of the new financial instruments. You know, we're seeing investors worrying about ESG, we're seeing green bonds. There seems to be a whole kind of financial world of new instruments that's sort of stumbling. Some of it's PR, clearly, some of it's greenwashing, clearly, but some of it is stumbling towards some of these questions, which is how to put a value on assets that we have not valued up until now. Do you see this as encouraging?
Oh, yes, indeed. For now, we know that there is this a voluntary approach from the financial system to address environmental emergencies as climate, but we have started to define taxonomies. And it was good to see that the European Union adopted a very complete taxonomy for projects that can be considered greenwashing if we do not, of course, have a clear framework and a clear methodologies to really measure their impacts. I think that the materiality of all these new instruments are quite important. But let me give some examples of these possible blue bonds, because all this climate neutrality is about removals. And we are measuring emissions, and sometimes we are measuring, of course, offset in the terms of removals, but the metrics are not clear. Because we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we have to balance our emissions. We need those projects, and mangroves, for example, are very effective ecosystems to remove CO2. They grow very rapidly, and they can capture CO2 or sequester CO2 in a better way than forest, for example, in the northern hemisphere. So it is good to expand the taxonomy to blue projects or blue initiatives, because we are starting to know how to manage coastal ecosystem, marine ecosystems. There is a wave of new efforts to really gather information about how these ecosystems are functioning, and very soon we will be able also to enhance their capture attributes, and that is a trend that is important. There are also new, of course, initiatives to really, or economic instruments and financial instruments to really expand the possibilities to mitigate greenhouse gases. And many of them, of course, are designed in a very classic way. Let me put it this way. If we started to see climate emergencies as we are expecting, because we are not in fact reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we saw the emission gap report from UNEP that only, well, all NDCs, the NDCs that our countries submitted to the UNFCCC Secretariat will have a reduction of 7.5% of the emissions today, and we need to multiply that by 7 times if we really want to be in the road, well, aligned to the roadmap of 1.5 degrees scenario. If we are going to do that, we need more aggressive measures, and it is important to rethink, in the case of climate emergencies, how we're going to use our, for example, nuclear powers plants. Okay. How we're going to use those infrastructures that can help us in really reduce greenhouse gases. So we need to think the taxonomies in the case that we do not reduce emissions in 10 years. And this is another possible way to, of course, address this situation that we are living.
Lots of questions coming in, so I just want to kind of whip around the panel a little bit if I can. Amar, can I ask you? Follows on very nicely, really. What are your hopes for the global summit in Glasgow? What do you hope will come out of it? What do you think is realistic to come out of it? And are your hopes and realistic expectations the same?
First of all, I think, the Glasgow conference has, I think, 3 elements which relate very nicely to this report and where the report in some sense can give impetus. The first is a recognition that, we must keep the 1.5 degrees in reach. And that means reaching net zero emissions mid-century in a concave way. Okay? So not postponing to the end, but doing it in an accelerated manner. And that relates very much to this report and the work, the relation to climate action. The second is a strong emphasis now on adaptation and resilience. And the reason I emphasize that is, all capital is not the same. And we have even produced capital. And the links between produced capital and natural capital becomes much more important. And the third aspect is, of course, as the Dasgupta report has emphasized, is really thinking about how do we invest in natural capital. And it's complicated because, it at one level, it's fish stocks, as we heard, but at another level, it's local communities. So you have to go from the very macro to the very micro in this area. So what are the big aspirations for COP26? Well, first, that we can turn this from a zero-sum game to a cooperative game. Those of us who work in the climate area make the case that a low-carbon future is not just a good climate future, it's a good development future. In terms not just of avoided costs, but it unlocks new and better forms of growth. And so if we can get COP26 to shift now to much more what you can do in a positive way, we would think it's very important. And again, as I said, the criticality of investment to actually now drive, the replenishment of all forms of capital, and a recognition that we have to stop the destruction of capital in order to be able to get short-term gains. So COP26, will probably leave more on the table than will be achieved, but that's not a failure. I think that as long as we have a clear roadmap coming out of COP26 on what needs to be done, in my view, that's good enough.
Okay. Another question, this one from Rayana Bohaka, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from the WHO. Maybe Karen could address this first of all. How can we build a stronger argument for health at the center of human capital investment and wealth? Is health there?
Yes, actually, the person who is asking the question will very much enjoy the part in the report that specifically brings in the linkage of air pollution on human health. There are estimates in the report that show how much actually countries could have grown if the human capital in countries could have grown globally if there had not been so much air pollution. So certainly we have taken that step. As we said before, we are refining the methodology and expanding the methodology with every report, but we are very conscious of it. And in the case of air pollution, one can really see the relationship between all the, be it the cardiac effects, the lung disease effects, and so on, of air pollution on human capital, and it reduces human capital. And it makes the case for better investments, both in environmental policy and also with a view to enhancing human well-being and increasing countries' human capital, indeed.
Okay, there's a couple of questions about other indexes that maybe Rodolfo or Amar or both could address. One from Aaron Tate Wimberley at Madison Street Capital. Does the Human Development Index more appropriately measure economic success and well-being over something like GDP? And Ryan O'Byrne from George Washington University says, what do you think of alternative measures of national prosperity like the World Happiness Report? And do they have a stronger relationship with sustainability? There are a lot of indexes knocking about. Do they elucidate or do they confuse? Perhaps I could start with Rodolfo.
Well, at the OECD, we are exploring some of those indexes or indicators, but we created a well-being lens process that we are applying now in cities. So the first step is to envision the outcome that we really want to have. If we understand how to do it, if we have the means to really reach that outcome, for example, as I was explaining, accessibility of goods and services, we can redesign the systems that we use to provide those goods and services. And with that methodology, we can have, of course, indicators that express the needs or the goals of our society. If the main objective of our community is to be happy, of course, we can measure something that is related with that in order to change the reality that is surrounding us. I think that this is something that we have to try. There are some very good examples, but of course, we have to develop and embedded these indicators in our national accounts. And this effort from the World Bank to really start measuring the wealth in a different way is a very good step to start thinking in new metrics, in new indicators, as the people is asking now.
Amar, I'd like to ask you something that comes out of the report. There was a map shown in the presentation preceding this panel discussion, and it showed a number of countries that had done very well. They'd done very well in terms of building up wealth per capita. I think the period is 1995 to 2018. There were countries like China, Vietnam, Cambodia, India, Ethiopia and Mozambique, Poland, and a couple of other Eastern European countries. And then there were 26 countries, some of them in Africa, where they'd actually gone backwards in terms of wealth per capita. What do you think are the crucial differences between the countries that have done well, which after all are scattered around the world? They're not geographically all in the same place, neither are they all at the same income level when they started, and those that have done poorly or less well, let's say, to be generous. What are the crucial differences?
There's been a long-standing discussion and examination of why have some countries done well on the flow variables, which is growth. Mm-hmm. And that mirrors itself in this, which is a stock way of looking at the same thing. And the World Bank has done a lot of work over the years on this through the Growth Commission and continuing examinations. And clearly, the root causes are, in some sense, has to do with governance. Countries have the ability to shape clear strategies, implement them, but East Asia, as has come to the fore on that, the East Asia Miracle exercise. So certainly governance and institutions matter a great deal, as does incentives for the private sector. The private sector clearly can make a big difference. And, in a lot of these cases, you see big contributions. And the third one is the centrality of human development. Okay. If you really want sustainable growth, you have to invest in people because they are the ones who will produce the capital. They are the ones who can look after also other forms of capital, including social and natural capital. So I think, it is good that we have seen a lot of success in the developing world. By any indications, if you look at what has been achieved, since World War II, we made more progress on development progress than we had, in all the periods before. But this imbalance has to be addressed. And that's why I said that the next 3 decades could be the period where in some sense we could get more broad-based and inclusive growth, both within countries and across countries. And we have to apply these lessons that we have taken in terms of policies and institutions, in terms of the dynamism and contribution of the private sector, in the opportunities that now lie for leapfrogging. If you look at renewables, it's a leapfrogging opportunity. It's like the mobile telephony in the energy area. We can actually do a lot better by investing in the new technologies. So I'm personally quite excited that we can actually make a lot of progress. Coming back to the role of the state, coming back to the politics will be very important. But I think we have learned a great deal from the development experience to replicate elsewhere.
And there had been a question on any comments concerning the effect of government corruption. In a sense, you've addressed that. I mean, to put this overly crudely, one of the way that one develops is one takes natural capital, the flows from that, and one invests it in other things, human capital, produced capital, and the more efficiently you do that, the higher you build your stock of wealth and presumably ability to generate future income. And the less well you do that, the less you climb that ladder. And one of the key differences is presumably is corruption and governance. If that money is all parked in a Swiss bank account, then it's not going to do much good in building up your human or produced capital. Just briefly, I don't know how closely you've looked at these accounts as they relate to India, because India has done very well in building up wealth per capita. And clearly we know that it's been growing very fast. I mean, that stopped more recently, but certainly over the period examined. Yet we also know there has been quite a lot of environmental destruction. There's been a lot of pollution, externalities that will not appear in these accounts really. Just I wondered if what you saw these wealth accounts, how they elucidate the story of India, which is after all one of the kind of great development stories of our time. You're on mute, sir.
The report actually flags precisely those issues. Sometimes we call them co-benefits, but clearly, the growth model in India has generated lots of environmental harm and, destruction of natural capital. And there are important policy implications. You look at degraded land in India, you look at the wasteful subsidies that India has put into agriculture, in the way it has managed its water systems. There are powerful lessons. But I think India is beginning to take those lessons now on board. So, we are hopeful that the next phase of development will be more balanced capital and much more emphasis on restoration. India has set very, very aggressive targets on restoration of degraded land, on restoration of rivers and water bodies. And it has a kind of a low carbon future is a healthy future for India. More compact cities, better communities, less pollution, and at the heart of it for India will be the energy transition. India has the same number of coal-fired power plants as the United States has, but India's are unfortunately a lot younger and more polluting. So getting a hold of that issue, reforming the utilities, really accelerating renewable energy, as Prime Minister Modi has committed to do, all of those are in the feasible, possibility, and will allow India to play a kind of a major leadership role, both on climate and on development.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, which is roughly 90 seconds for the three panelists. In this year of, as we're beginning to come out of the pandemic in some parts of the world anyway, I wanted to ask about what sometimes are called black swan events that come out of nowhere, shocks. How much does wealth accounting throw light on an event like a pandemic and preparedness for a pandemic? Perhaps I could ask you, Karen. It's clearly not just a pandemic. If, we always deal with the last crisis, but it could be something else. Is there a way of measuring, you know, the resilience to future events that comes out, or that could come out of this wealth accounting methodology?
Well, yes, there is. Of course, I can't say anything about black swan events, because the definition of the black swan is that you don't know what it's going to be. But there are some things that are not really black swans, but we just haven't thought about them. And one of the things, for instance, is if you think of pandemics that are generated by zoonosis, for instance, we do know that it is really, really important to keep ecosystems intact. You do need to do that, and you need to look at how much you are encroaching, for instance, through urban sprawl or through other ways into areas where a lot of your natural capital sits. And that goes a bit back to the question from one of the previous questions that came through the live feed on how is it linked to health. Because we know that the natural system health is linked to human health, and that we need to manage that. So by having the natural accounts more and more looking at natural, at how you can put policies in place to maintain your natural capital and why that makes sense, you can actually look a bit into the future and say, well, we know that these things hang together. What could I and should I do today to maintain my natural capital and to grow my human capital and my overall prosperity? So indeed, I do think that that one can have that view to the future, and which is why this time we really gave it a future theme also in the report.
Right. Rodolfo, would you have anything to add to that? Can we measure resilience? Should we be trying?
We have to do it, because what we are expecting from this climate change are tipping points that are in fact like pandemics. No? I remember, for example, from Kerry Emanuel, famous paper, this description that at 2 degrees we could have the same climate that we had 2 million in the Pliocene, 2 million years before, with a El Niño permanent situation. And that means a tipping point. Another tipping point that we are expecting very soon, perhaps in 15 years, is this the loss of coral reefs massively. If this happens, you know, coral reefs as mangroves are like fish in nurseries, and we will be facing a complete depletion of fisheries. And that is a tipping point that we don't know how to, of course, the societies will react, but many, of course, coastal populations will migrate. We have to be prepared for that. So we need to measure how resilient we are to those events, measuring, of course, the number of dead people because of extreme weather events, the people that is migrating, the people that is reducing their quality of life because of heat waves or extreme weather events that are changing their activities in the agricultural sector, in the forestry sector, inside the cities. So these new metrics are very useful to look at the most important part of the elements that are sustaining life, but also that are giving us this comfort that we are living and enjoying.
Okay, I think that's a perfect place to end what I think has been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank Brookings, I'd like to thank the World Bank, and I'd like to obviously thank the audience, but I'd also like to recommend that they really do download and look at this report, because if you're only looking at GDP, you're really only looking at half the picture at best. And this report will help you think about the world differently and fill in some of the blanks. It will raise a lot of questions as well as answer them, but that is no bad thing. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Brookings. Thank you to the World Bank. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.